Hello, I'm Kamila Shamsie. I'm one of the writers who's been involved with Refugee Tales, and I'm also a great admirer of Refugee Tales and the Gatwick Detainees Welfare Group. In the last few months, I found myself returning again and again to a phrase that I associate with Refugee Tales and the campaign to end indefinite detention: counting up. When prisoners are given a jail sentence, they can count down to their release date. When refugees are placed in detention, they can only count up from the date of incarceration, with no knowing how high the number will go. In the last few months, we've all been counting up. Counting up from the last time we saw people we love, counting up from the last time we were at liberty to traverse the cities and towns in which we live, counting up from the last time we planned for an imaginable future. And for some people, those who are the most vulnerable, still counting up from the last time they left the confines of their homes. But when I say I found myself returning again and again to a phrase that I associate with Refugee Tales and the campaign to end indefinite detention, I don't mean to imply that the weeks and months in lockdown led me to think, oh, now I know what it is like to be in detention. Quite the contrary. In fact, while I was counting up, I was also reading and writing and going on walks and having Zoom calls and living with people I love. And I knew that the lockdown wouldn't go on forever, that things would turn a corner, and most importantly of all, I knew that the lockdown had not been implemented with the express purpose of making people like me suffer. So when I considered those in detention centres, I thought how lucky I was that my counting up took the form it did. I thought of how many people had been living in a counting up world far before the pandemic started, and how they would continue to live in that world regardless of improved treatments and vaccines, unless something were to change. In the years since I first came to know David and Anna and all the other fine people of Refugee Tales, I've been talking and thinking about the indefinite part of indefinite detention. The UK is the only country in Europe that doesn't have a time limit on detention. That must change. This is where many of us have focused our attention, on the indefinite article. But in my privileged counting up world, I was already beginning to understand something that came to the fore when David and Anna wrote to say that the theme for Refugee Tales 2020 is calling for a future without detention. The real problem wasn't the indefinite. It was the detention. That was the word that separated me in my indefinite counting up pandemic world from those in an indefinite counting up Gatwick detention centre world. Indefinite was merely the modifier. Detention was the noun. Without detention, indefinite was free to wander off and attach itself to words such as colour or shape, or better yet the phrase leave to remain. Indefinite leave to remain, that really should be the only use of indefinite in our immigration system. While I was thinking all this, the Black Lives Matters movement gained force and strength and opposing vitriol, not just in America, but in many countries of the world, including the UK. It brought together so many strands of news that had been in the daily headlines: the 3rd anniversary of Grenfell, the continuing scandal of Windrush and the government's failure to right the injustices unearthed there, the vastly disproportionate number of ethnic minorities dying of COVID-19. The tales of refugees detained for an undefined period slots easily in right beside all those other stories. These are all stories of a society with a profound fault line running through it, a fault line of race. Not all detainees are from minority ethnic backgrounds, but a very high proportion are, and the manner in which they are treated cannot be separated from other stories of institutional racism. Why detain refugees? The government claims it's merely a bureaucratic step that precedes deportation. But this claim is given the lie by the simple statistic that tells us that more than 50% of those who are detained are then released back into the community. So why do it? All questions of humanity aside, why the vast expense of detention centres? According to the Migration Observatory, the annual cost of detention for the year ending March 2019 was £89 million. Through the years of austerity, you never heard the government talk of cutting those costs. Cut legal aid, yes. But don't cut the cost of detention centres which fail to serve their alleged purpose and where so many are wrongfully held. Oh, and that wrongfully held costs the government too. For the year ending March 2019, there were 312 proven cases of wrongful detention, for which the government paid £8.2 million in compensation. Why do it? Amelia Gentleman, writing in The Guardian about the Windrush scandal, spoke of the exhausting humiliations of a system that is designed to grind people into submission. That humiliation and grinding down is the primary purpose of a system of detention that is costly, inefficient, and unjust. It is part of Theresa May's hostile environment. It exists to send a message. If you're seeking to escape an unbearable life, don't come here. We'll treat you terribly. And if you are already here, leave. When I wrote The Lover's Tale for Refugee Tales, the man I interviewed asked that I not reveal the name of the country in which he had been tortured and from which he had fled. He didn't want anyone from that country reading the piece and tracking him down. But he did want me to use his first name. It was his name. He wanted it in his story. But at the last minute he changed his mind. He asked me to use a pseudonym. This wasn't because he was worried about the government of the country he'd fled. It was because he was worried about being identified by someone from the UK government. This was a man who had gone through a period of detention before his asylum claim was accepted on appeal. He was legally entitled to be in Britain. But he had to reapply every few years to maintain his legal status, and his experiences with the UKBA had taught him that an act as straightforward as recounting the story of his experiences, a story told in a markedly factual way without analysis or commentary, the act of telling that story could result in his next application being turned down. This is the face the UK government shows to those who come here looking for refuge. It is not accidental that this man, whose name I can't utter, ended up feeling this way. The hostile environment of which detention centres are a part are designed to give rise to such feelings. And let's be clear, Theresa May might have given a name to the hostile environment, but she was only naming something that had been taking shape for a very long time. It doesn't have to be this way. Once, in the 1970s, this country had welcome centres for refugees. Morton Hall in Lincolnshire was one such centre, set up for refugees arriving from Vietnam to help them in making the transition to life in the UK. Morton Hall is now an immigration removal centre, and last year the government was ordered to pay £82,000 in compensation to a Vietnamese teenager, a victim of modern slavery, who was illegally held at Morton Hall and sexually assaulted in his time there. Morton Hall encapsulates the trajectory of the story of how Britain treats its refugees. From welcome centres to places of violence and illegal detention. The way forward is clear. The government must shut down the detention centres and in their place give us, once more, ways to welcome those who see Britain as a place where they can lead a better life. It sounds like a dream, I know. But in truth, the reversal of that narrative, the shift from welcome to detention, has been a nightmare that we've lived with too long. It is time to wake up, and in our wakened state, dream an even bolder dream than the one of welcome centres in the far from unproblematic 1970s. It is time to dream of justice and humanity. Thank you all for listening. In saying goodbye, I want to repeat words said to me in March. I wish you health and optimism.